Okay, we are live on air now. Hi, my name is Karen Jensen. I am from Teen Librarian Toolbox, and today we are here for our historical fiction edition of the Sexual Violence in Young Adult Literature project. We're going to be talking about some specific historical fiction titles and just about feminism and the role of sexual violence in history and what we can learn from it in our reading. Sharon Biggs Waller is one of our participants. She's having some technical difficulties, so hopefully she will join us in a little bit. If not, we will still be here, and we have with us today Jennifer McGowan, who is the author of Maid of Secrets, and Katherine Longshore, who is the author of Gilt. All right. And like I said, hopefully soon, Sharon Biggs Waller, who wrote A Mad Wicked Folly. We're going to talk about these books. We're going to talk about historical fiction and young adult literature in general. And we're just going to see where the conversation takes us. So Jen is going to be our moderator today, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
All right. Thank you very much, Karen. I'm so excited to be here, and I'll talk a little bit about myself and then have Katie Longshore introduce herself as well. As Karen said, my name is Jen McGowan. I write young adult historical fiction, specifically in the Elizabethan era. My books are about a group of spies who work for Queen Elizabeth I. I have been writing for about 10 years, and Maid of Secrets was my very first published novel, and it is followed up with Maid of Deception, which comes out in August, and then Maid of Wonder, which will come out in next August of 2015. So I'd like to hand it over to Katie to talk a little bit about herself and her books.
Hi, I'm Katherine Longshore. I am the author of 4 books of historical fiction for young adults, a series set in the court of Henry VIII, which starts with Gilt and carries on through Tarnish and Brazen. They're all about actual people who lived actual lives, and it's a fictionalized account of what happened to them while they were at the court. And I have a standalone with Scholastic called Maid of Secrets, which is a completely different story. It's set in the Edwardian era, and it's more like a Downton Abbey for young adults.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and launch into our very first question, which talks about the research. And the research that led to your novels, and we'll start first with Katie and then I'll jump in myself. What was the most surprising thing that you've learned about the women in the era that you were writing about?
Well, I think because I already knew how difficult life has been for women throughout history in many cultures, the most surprising thing for me in doing my research was finding women who actually had some agency within their own lives, women who had their own property, were able to invest their own money and live their own lives without having to feel or act as if they were something to be owned and moved around by their fathers, brothers, husbands, whatever. Anne of Cleves is one of my favorites. She was Henry VIII's 4th wife. She was basically a mail-order bride. She lived in one of the German duchies, and Henry VIII needed a wife who was a Protestant, and they found her and brought her over. He didn't like her, but they married anyway, and ultimately he decided that he didn't want to be married to her anymore, so they got an annulment, and she had kind of a severance package. She got several different houses, she got her own money, she had her own household, and she was able to live out the rest of her life without having to deal with anybody else or have anybody tell her what to do. And that was a huge surprise to come across because most women couldn't do that. It's sad that that's the surprise.
Absolutely. I think with my own research, I was surprised at how much was expected of women. I mean, they really had to support the family and help take care of the farm, help take care of the husband, take care of the children, of course, have the children, raise them pretty much on their own. And yet they had no personal provenance, if you will. They owned nothing. Their very bodies, as Katie pointed out, were owned either by their fathers or their husbands as a part of the marriage decree. And yet so much was expected of them that they just couldn't get out of their situation. And in my first book, Maid of Secrets, I found that people were a little bit surprised at the idea of Meg not wanting to get married, because that was such an accepted part of being an Elizabethan young woman. And yet, in her particular circumstance, she had grown up in a large theater troupe, and so she was able to ensure this would happen without, or live her own life, if you will, without having to rely on somebody else. And I think we have, do we have Sharon here?
Sharon here.
Yay!
Oh, wonderful. Well,
I'm in the middle of a hot flash because I was just like running back and forth, back and forth. The dogs are barking, my husband comes in. Sorry about that, guys.
but you're here.
Thank you all.
Yay.
That is great. Well, your timing is phenomenal. We just finished our introductions and just launched into the first question, so we'll go ahead and backtrack just a tiny bit so that you can introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your book.
Okay, let's see. I'm Sharon Biggs Waller, and my debut novel is Mad, Wicked Folly, which is set during the Edwardian era and against the backdrop of the suffragette movement. And it's about a young 17, 18-year-old Edwardian girl who wants to be an artist but is sort of denied that right by her parents and society at large. And she decides that she needs to fight for a loftier goal of women's rights, for her own voice to be heard. So, and then there's a dishy police officer in it and a few other fun things. So yeah, I'm really excited to be part of this because there's a lot of interesting things that have come up about the book, and I just would love to talk about it, and just historical fiction and how we can help better the present with the past. So yeah, that's me, sort of.
Actually, the first question was, were there any surprises that you encountered in your research about women of the time period? Anything that took you a little off guard?
Well, you know, it did, because, you know, I think people think that the Victorian era and the Edwardian era gets lumped together a lot, and it's understandable because the Edwardian era was only 10 years, not very a long period of time, and so people tend to think that women were very, you know, coy, not coy, but what's the word I'm looking for? You know, virginal and didn't care about sex at all, and really, you know, had to be escorted about. And I have read from a lot of people that have said that, you know, a lot of bad things have been written about women, mostly by male authors, about the women during that time, that they were not these little shrinking violets. And I thought, how can I really portray that? And then I started reading about more and more women in the suffrage movement and how tough they were. And they weren't just handing out pamphlets. They were doing lots of things. They were really strong, and they were breaking these bonds, and they were living with men and not getting married. There was one couple that took each other's names. They double-barreled their names. There were men that believed in women's rights. It was a completely different time than we think. It wasn't just about the cute little valentines and the beautiful clothes. These women were really, they were laying their lives on the line. They were being force-fed in prison. They were being, you know, victims of police brutality. They were throwing themselves in front of horses. They were getting killed. It wasn't just this genteel time. And so, yeah, that really did kind of shock me. I didn't think it was as much violence as it was. So, and there were more strong women than I really realized. So it was good.
Yeah. Raise a really. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, one of the things that really struck me reading A Mad, Wicked Folly was how her fight, it didn't just affect her, it would affect her family, and, you know, the way that society viewed them, and the way whether or not they could earn their income, and those type of things. Like, it was like really that much harder for her to make that decision because it didn't just affect her. And I thought that was really well spelled out.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's you know, it was important for me to kind of not just make it about her, but about how she was going to exist in this world, and how she would actually try to be who she wanted to be. And it did affect her family, and if she didn't make a choice to be different, then it would affect her family too, especially with her little niece, because she wanted to be a role model for her. So, but it just took a long time to figure out how to weave that in without being didactic, I guess. I think all writers kind of struggle with that. So, yeah. He's not.
Outstanding. And actually, your comment leads me to the next question, which you say that we have this attitude of women being, oh, they need to be demure, they need to be coddled, they need to be led around. And the next question talks about how these historical views of women have led to incidents of sexual violence acted against them both in history and today. How do you feel that historical views have contributed to that? And we can go ahead and start with Katie.
Well, I think that any time that you treat someone or something as if it doesn't have any kind of emotions or feelings or abilities of its own, you can marginalize it and look at it as something that doesn't necessarily need the same kind of tact or understanding or compassion as anything else. If you look at slavery, or if you look at the way people treat their dogs sometimes, they don't necessarily act as if that thing deserves any kind of good treatment. So if you look at women and how throughout history and many cultures they were considered property, they weren't allowed education, they weren't allowed to choose their own clothes or their own husbands or anything like that. You're treating them like something that isn't worthwhile, and that gives a false impression that if it isn't worthwhile, then you can treat it however you want. So of course there are always going to be people who take advantage of that and will beat somebody or their dog who isn't worth their time or energy or love. And that is something that will continue as long as people don't look at women as something that is a thinking and cognizant being. As long as there's objectification in the media and online and whatnot, it will just keep happening.
Sharon, do you have any additional comments on that?
Yeah, I really agree with everything Katie said, and I think when you dehumanize something or someone, it's easy to treat it as less than what you are. And I think that's kind of what happens with this. We hear a lot of it in other countries where women are treated as chattel, and they can just do what they want. And I think when it comes to violence done against women in that era, is that there was really nothing that women could do. I was just looking in, I had spoke about the Victorian era, and they were saying that women were often looked at that were raped or abused or whatever. They were looked at as unclean and part of the problem. So you can imagine these women were wearing corsets, and they were wearing a lot of clothing, and so that whole thing of you were dressing, you were asking for it. It was, what if they even looked a certain way, or the man could claim, she's looking at me like this, then she was walking by herself, so she was a prostitute. And the police would often harass women walking by themselves and treat them as prostitutes or tell them to go home. They had no right to be out on the street. Now this was in London, which is kind of, or England as well, and so that's sort of where my my research lies, and I'm quite sure it was pretty much the same in America, although probably not as much, although I'm not 100% sure. I can imagine it was. So a lot of violence was done against them, and they couldn't talk out about it. They couldn't speak out about it. And a lot of incest was also not illegal. So any kind of abuse that they received from their family, was not, and nothing was done about it. Now there was an interesting thing that would happen on ships as well, between boys, violence against boys and older sailors, and if homosexuality in the Navy was a hanging offense. There was basically somebody could say he did this with this other guy, and they were both killed. They're both hung immediately, and the child was hung too. So the child, the victim, both were just absolutely done away with. And now that's even more horrific, because if you were on a ship, you had no way to get away from your tormentor, and somebody could pin it on you or whatever. So it's not just women that were treated like that. It was also young men, boys, were also, a lot of violence was done against them as well. So.
I would add that even the cultures of making women into these elite objects, like these extreme objects of beauty, was actually also contributory to this idea that they were something other. They weren't human in a sense, and so therefore they didn't get the same type of actions accorded to them. I think in particular in China, when the exalted women had their feet bound, and they originally did that so that their feet appeared smaller, so that they could dance and be considered great beauties, and it was a mark of status to be able to do this, and horribly crippling, this practice, and yet it was something that was considered perfectly reasonable, because to be put into this position meant that you were a woman of status, you were highly coveted, and then therefore it was okay. So even in situations where the women were treated otherwise because they were higher social class, they still had this sort of subjugation that made them somewhat separate and able to be manipulated. Aaron,
in Gilt, Katherine Longshore's book, when it starts out, and Kitty, one of the main characters, we're hearing the story through her point of view. She witnesses another woman being raped, and there's a sense she's like, for a moment, what can I do here? And if she went to try to talk to anybody and report it to the authorities because she was a woman, that she wouldn't be, believed or anything like that. And it's, I think it's the book, The Madman's Daughter. The main character ends up being in a position of, poverty, and this person that she works for is basically gives her an ultimatum. So. Kid, where she's saying, he's basically propositioning her, and it's a form of sexual violence. He's trying to make her do things against her will using his power, and she knows that she can't do anything about it because of her position, and I think that's part of it too. When I was reading both of those books, the idea that, because they always say sexual violence isn't really about sex, it's about power. But it's also about that lack of power when you see it from the victim's point of view. Because, especially, when you look at how victims go when they try to report and they're not believed or they're blamed or those types of things. And particularly, I think we're making strides to get better at that. But in these historical novels, you see they had nothing. There was no one they could go to. So,
yeah. But you raise a really good point, and actually leads into the next question of, in terms of the authors here, how have you addressed the question of sexual violence in your particular works? We'll go ahead and start with Katherine, since you mentioned what Kitty observed. But how have you addressed it? How has it turned out in your actual works?
That was a very tough scene to write. I knew it was something. I knew it was a historical incident that I knew I had to include somehow, because it involved one of the main characters, somebody that she would have a lot of interaction with later on, and it was an actual historical event. It was something that one of Henry VIII's courtiers had. He was caught and accused of raping a woman and then killing her husband, and Henry VIII pardoned him because he liked the guy, and that the idea of that horrified me. the incident has been addressed in other historical works as either something that could be pardoned, or that it was a lie, or that it was a completely different event that got somehow thrown out of proportion. But I wanted to deal with it as it was written down, because it was important to me to address the issue of the fact that it could just be like brushed under the rug, like so many incidents have been in the past 10, 20, 50 years. I also wanted to approach the idea of somebody who could watch something like that and not do anything about it, and the reasons why. And that was very difficult, because it's, of course, something that most of us would want to go and do something about. So Kitty had to be afraid for her life and her own safety, but she also had to be aware that no matter what she did, people either weren't going to believe her, or they were going to accuse her of being out in this place by herself, and therefore having maybe gone out there to do something that she shouldn't have done. And she knew that she wouldn't have had any power over the situation. So the first time I wrote the scene, I just flat out wrote it with as much vivid detail as I possibly could. And so this is very early on. Gilt was my first book that I got published, and I showed it to an agent at a workshop, and she said this is where I would stop reading, because this is too much. Wow. So I had to pull it back. And it's very different from the very first scene that I wrote, but I think that it still has a visual impact, and I hope that it still has some resonance for people today, and some ideas that people today can look at and say, okay, this was wrong, what needs to happen next?
Sharon?
Well, I just want to say that scene that she's talking about is fantastic in the book, and my heart was like pounding when I was reading it. And I think this is right when we kind of first started doing the corset cut list thing, and I think I emailed you and said, oh my gosh, why are you such a good writer? You know? It was really good. And then she told me there was more to it. I was like, well, I want to read the rest of that. It just so brought it all to life, and it was just horrifying, and it was really, really fabulous. So, I mean, as far as a writer's point of view, not as far as what was going on, but I think you portrayed that so wonderfully. And so anyway, with Folly, I actually had in one of my first kind of drafts, one of the characters was kind of a rake, and they could kind of do what they wanted with their servants in the Edwardian Victorian times, because they were deathly afraid of losing their jobs, and a lot of servants were preyed upon by the men of the house, and a lot of children were born out of wedlock, and they were the boss's child, so to speak. And so, but if they were caught, they were the ones that were blamed, and they were thrown out, and they were not given a character reference. And so many of them became what was called, they turned to prostitution, because that's all that they could do. And they were called dolly mops, because they were former servants. So any prostitute that became, servant turned prostitute was that. So actually very, very kind of a terrible time in history for a lot of working class women. In my book, but of course, you have to pick and choose what you're going to add in your book, and we all know as historical writers our books tend to be kind of big. There's so much to talk about, and so it wasn't really where the book should go. So the violence that I have in my book against women tend to be to the suffragettes, the outward violence. And I was told this by the curator of the London Museum, is that what a lot of police would tear at their clothing, because they would wear, when women chained themselves to the railing, they would put the belt underneath their clothing, because they knew that they wouldn't take their clothes off to take the belt off. Well, a lot of police figured that out, not all of them, but the ones that had no problem with this, is undressing them in the street. And so that does happen to Lucy, my American suffragette character, who I have based on Alice Paul, and he kind of rips her clothes off while Vicky is standing there. And Vicky is unwilling. She's unwilling to leave the scene at first because she's drawing it. She's unwilling to leave the scene for the second time because she's seeing this girl being humiliated and her clothing taken off of her. And so she's bearing witness to this happening. I'm so sorry. The UPS guy just showed up. I'll be right back. Carrie.
Oh, if only I knew how to edit.
Or the UPS person was a female. And this is violence against female in modern times.
I'm going to close my window.
I'm back. You were not outside where the goats would probably be climbing all over everything. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Anyway, what was I saying?
The suffragettes.
The suffragettes. Yeah. So she's bearing witness to this happening, although she can't do much about it. But she does. When P.C. Fletcher comes up, she says, "Okay, goats ring." She says, "What is happening? Why is this happening?" And I might just go ahead and mute myself for a second.
Okay.
Well, I can go ahead and jump in until the
Oh God, I don't even know. Okay.
All right.
All right. In Maid of Secrets, I didn't actually have a lot of violence against women. Meg, my character there, was very rough and tumble, and she enjoyed living very much as a man would because of the nature of how she was brought up. In Maid of Deception, which is my upcoming book, I am dealing with a young woman who is a highly positioned woman in the court. She has money, she has status, she has beauty, she has everything a woman could want. And so it was interesting for me to have her in situations which pitted her against the men of the court. And she was in a circumstance where, in order to get back at her for something that she had done, she was literally threatened with being defiled, essentially. And the gentleman who was doing this, and he was a gentleman of the court, the gentleman who was doing this knew that she could not protest, because if she protested, her entire family would be shamed. And so she was faced with the situation of how does she get out of this, essentially a threat of rape and defilement and public humiliation, knowing that she could only go so far and still protect her family's name. So it was a difficult scene to write, but I think one that many women faced. You're allowed to have so much power, but when you get to a certain point where you are running up against men who felt that they should have more power than you, there was a very simple way for them to put you in your place. All right. Okay.
You guys are never going to invite me back on one of these things again.
But let's talk a little bit about the characters, your main characters in your novel. I was recently on a talking about how to make the characters seem relevant to the modern reader while still being true to their historical roots. Perhaps we'll start with Katie. How were you able to sort of find that blend?
It's a difficult and touchy situation, like you say, because we live in a world where they don't have any kind of agency and they don't have any way of protecting themselves or being heard. It's hard to write a female character into that situation who either has those things or wants those things. But I figured that throughout history and in every situation there are always people who are curious about how to get out of any kind of situation that ties them so closely. I mean, I actually took some of my inspiration from the suffragettes because they lived in a world where they didn't have the right to vote and they didn't have very many rights at all, and yet they felt very strongly and very powerfully that they deserved these things. So I figured, why couldn't somebody who lived 500 years ago want the same kind of things? If you're in a situation where you're bound and shackled, of course you imagine what it would be like to be able to roam free. So that's how I created my characters, as kind of the unusual person in this pool of humanity that everybody else accepted what was going on.
Excellent. Sharon?
So what was the question again? It was like the modern, how do we make them relevant?
Right. How do you, knowing that you're writing for a modern reader, but you're presenting a historical character, how do you balance that?
Okay, this is like one of my favorite questions that you asked in your email, and yeah, for me, you know, I have heard people saying, you know, she's modern. How did you, you know, she's this modern girl in this historical world. Well, first of all, I got the permission for doing that, the same what Katie was saying, is that through the suffragettes. But the other thing is, if you think of it this way, is that there were a lot of women that were really, yes, they were different, but there were a lot of really strong women that knew what they wanted, just like Katie said, and were willing to do it. I mean, that it's written all through time. You know, that women have done these amazing things. And I'm sorry, but I don't think that all of a sudden, in modern world, women just went, oh, you know what, I want something. You know, I think the mindset was there. They weren't able to voice what they wanted. And so we don't see it in history, in the main parts of history. And also, men really were the ones publishing. Women didn't really have a voice. And so how do we know exactly who was doing what then? For me, it was a little bit easier in the Edwardian era because there is just so much material of these women breaking free their bonds. I mean, it was just one story after the next of what they wanted to do, why they became suffragettes, and so I had this rich, you know, material to choose from. So I sort of say to people when they're, you know, she's not modern, we'll prove it. Prove it that she does. No one would have that kind of mindset. So I try to think about, as far as connecting her to a modern reader, is that it's a universal story of wanting something, of wanting to better yourself and having this goal of expression. And I think that's really it. We all want our voices to be heard. And when you try to sort of dampen down on that and just sort of be in lockstep with everybody else, then your soul dies. I don't care what it is. I don't care what you want to do, who you want to be. And a lot of times for women, that's perceived as selfishness. And that makes me really sad, because I think if you don't explore who you are as a human being and be the person you want to be, how are you being a role model for other women? How are you teaching women how to be happy in their lives? And so it's not just a matter of neglecting everybody else around you. It's only through expressing yourself can you really help other people. And I know a lot of people have said, you know, comparing it to the oxygen mask that comes down in the airplane, you've got to put yours on first before you can help the other person. And I think that's kind of a good thing. What's really surprised me is that, and I haven't heard this from teenagers, but I have heard it from some bloggers who have accused Vicky of being selfish. And that amazes me that a modern woman today would accuse a character, especially a young character, of being selfish. Do you not remember what it was like to be a teenager? You could not see anybody else but yourself. And I think that you're hardwired that way because you're developing into who you want to be. And that really surprised me. I never heard that from any teenagers, but I have heard it from you know, 20, 30-something bloggers, and I'm just sort of like, not really, that amazes me. So, yeah, anyway.
But I do think as a woman, and especially like as a mom, there is still this sense that women are supposed to be much more self-sacrificial than you even see necessarily, you know, men being called out to be. You know, nobody you know, I'm married, I have a husband, we have 2 kids. Nobody ever wonders, like, you know, well, what happens if the kids get sick? How's that going to affect his job? But they wonder how it's going to affect my job, because, you know, there's still that expectation that the woman, the mother, has to be sacrificial
Yeah.
in ways that we don't expect men to be. And I think that's probably where you see in that comment and those questions. So
yeah, that's a good point.
I would agree with both of those points. In the Maid's books, I have 5 young women who are all very different, all from different walks of life, and they are kind of put in this sort of rarefied environment where they're spies, so they do have a little more latitude than a typical woman would. But by the same token, they also are a product of their own upbringing. And so for me, it really came down to when I needed a character to act in a way that many people would have considered contrary to her upbringing, like, for instance, Meg not wanting to get married, and Beatrice being willing to defy the queen, as she does in book 2, it all came down to motivation. Like, they had to really want it badly enough to make it worthwhile to them, that they were willing to sacrifice their own personal safety, personal comfort, you know, and their why had to be strong enough to really justify to me, and then hopefully to the reader as well, why they were willing to stand outside of the bonds of normal society, because you were punished pretty heavily for that. It's such a contradiction. The Elizabethan court was a very bawdy place. Elizabeth herself was quite young. She came to power at age 25. She'd had sort of a circuitous route to get to the castle, and she by no means was a shy and retiring young woman. She liked to dance, she liked to party, and she liked to have around her a very lively group of courtiers and ladies. However, you could only go so far in her court in order to, you know, still maintain her favor. You had to essentially support her and laud her and celebrate her, but you could not have too much fun, if you will, with each other, or you were subject to terrible censure. There are endless stories of women, specifically women, more so than men, that she banned from the court simply for appearing to be too lively or too flirtatious. So it was kind of a difficult path to walk. You had to be lively, but you couldn't be too flirtatious, too outgoing, too overt. So it was this constant balance with trying to please the queen and pursue your own goals, and that I think is not unlike a lot of the situations people still face today. You know, Beatrice a lot of times in the comments was referred to as the mean girl of my group, if you will. You know, she was one who was somewhat haughty. She was bold and a little bit critical, and so in writing her story, it's like, well, why did she become that way? Because all of us come to the situation, especially in our teens, we're made that way for some reason. There are reasons behind the things that we do, and a lot of times it is because we have a mask that we want to show the public, because we don't want to betray too much of who we are inside. And so a lot of that kind of came into play as well as I was fleshing out her character. So it's interesting. I think the historical background gives you a unique prism into a character, because you've got very typical girls, but they're surrounded with all this pageantry of history. So it sort of makes their story a little bit larger than life. So great. All right. Well, getting a little bit back to the topic then of actual violence. You know, we have covered a variety of eras in time. We've got Elizabethan, Edwardian, Tudor time periods. I'm not sure if you all are working on other books in other periods as well, but please mention that if you are. How has it changed? Do you feel like we've come a long way? Do you feel like we could see the end of sexual violence in our lifetimes based on our newly enlightened age, if you will? Or have we not traveled as far as perhaps we should have in the intervening 200 to 500 years? Sharon, would you like to begin?
Sure. Seeing as things are quiet in the house right now. I don't think so. I think violence against women is is going to happen. It's going to continue to happen. And I thought that we were making strides in that, but then things started happening with a young woman in Ohio, you know, and how people treated her horrified me. And I can't even imagine going through that as a young woman, how it would change you. And I think the thing is, Krista Desir says, we just have to keep making this a conversation. We have to keep showing, you know, that we need to think about it, of how we treat victims of sexual assault. But I don't know that it will ever end. I think violence is always going to be there, and I just would hope that people that are victims of sexual assault have a voice. That is what I'm hoping, that they feel that they can speak out, not be judged, and treated, you know, equally with any other victim of crime. I hate, you know, that makes me sound like it makes me sound kind of negative when I say that, but I don't know. I don't think it will ever go away. I would hope that it would lessen, and I would hope that women are not blamed for it. That's what I'm hopeful. So I could say I'm hopeful. How about that? That's probably where I'm willing to stay. How about you, Katie?
We can always be hopeful.
Yeah.
You expressed exactly how I was feeling, Sharon, because when Jen sent these questions out this morning, my first thought was, well, no, it's never going to change. And then I thought, gosh, that sounds so negative. But unfortunately, the situations that we've seen in the past haven't really changed that much. You know, the rape scene in Gilt is based on a historical event, and Henry pardoned the courtier who did it. And people are still doing that today. I mean, you hear in the news about a group of football players who took advantage of a girl who was drunk, and the town came out in support of the football players because they had a good future ahead of them. Yeah. And nobody said anything about the girl. Mm-hmm. Part of the reaction that I wrote in Gilt to this rape is based on an event that happened only 5 years ago at Richmond High School, where a group of students witnessed a brutal rape and did nothing. So my hope is that, yes, that people will be able to find a voice, that they will be able to talk about these things and express themselves in ways that are empowering and not victimizing. But what we need to do as we move forward is to be able to give people that power. I read recently about, and I don't think it's nationwide, but there are certainly some courts that when a rape comes to trial, they don't allow anybody to use the word rape because it could influence the jury. So wow. They have to use phrases like they had sex instead, but it has a completely different connotation.
Oh. So we can't death, murder.
Exactly. Until we're able to discuss these things like we are now, openly and with enough passion and with the right words and phrasings, we're not going to be able to get past it. So my hope is that rather than regress, as some courts seem to be, that we can push ourselves forward and actually learn to have the conversation without pointing fingers or laying blame, and especially with our sons and with the men in our lives, and say, you know, these are important words to be able to use, and these are important things for women to be able to say, and you need to be able to accept that, and let's move forward together.
You know, you make an important point, though, because, you know, language is power. Like, the idea that they can't use the word rape in court, that's just astounding and, you know, just horrifying, because sex is totally different than rape. But even like A.S. King, who is one of my favorite authors, she is going to be participating later in the year, and when her and I were talking back and forth, she said, like one of the things that she really wants to see happen is for us to stop calling date rape, because even just having the word date in front of it makes it sound more, less than what it is. She's like, date rape is just rape. Like, rape is rape, and we don't need to put these cushy words in front of it to make it sound, better or anything like that, because it's not. It's rape, and we need to call it rape. And the words have power, and I think, Jennifer's question was, do you see it changing? But I think just the fact that we can talk about it now and that we have a platform, like, that's obviously a step in the right direction, because, a lot of the characters in your books, they had nobody they could talk to, and they probably didn't even, talk to each other about what was happening. It was all hush-hush, and nobody talked about it, and so being able to talk about it is a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
I think I'd agree. That's probably been the biggest aha I've had towards thinking about this question and hearing your responses. I don't know that the violence will ever go away. I don't know that we as humans are ever going to necessarily evolve past a penchant for violence and doing things to subvert the power of other people. But I think what has changed is the ability for dialogue. I think of the women, certainly in the time that I'm writing about, it did exist where you could tell somebody about some violence that was perpetrated against you, but it was very much on a one-on-one type of basis. Your father could avenge you, your brothers could avenge you. They may not even express why they're doing the avenging, but so if you had a strong family unit, you could be protected and you could be avenged after the fact, and that absolutely did happen, and that plays a part in Beatrice's tale as well, in Maid of Deception. But it was not something that you could put forth on the public stage. It was not something that you could bring a public retribution. As Katherine pointed out, King Henry, and not only King Henry, but other monarchs as well, had a terrible penchant of simply pardoning the courtiers who were in their favor for any indiscretions that they should happen to enact against women. Even if these individuals were married, even if the woman who was attacked was married, that's okay. He's one of my guys, so it's not a problem. So that contributed to the, I think, the powerlessness of women. However, as time has progressed, we have found that there are forums for conversation, and again, opportunities like this, the mere fact that we know about those situations that happened, in Ohio, in this high school in Richmond, where we've witnessed these travesties and we were talking about it. I think those kind of conversations give young women especially the ability to feel like they can come forward, the ability to know that if something were to happen to them, if they were assaulted or raped, they should go immediately to the hospital so that evidence can be gathered and they can be taken care of and their needs met so that somebody doesn't continue on to do this to other people. The fact that we're even having those kind of conversations, I think that is specifically where the hope lies. And the more we make it almost a public shaming of these kind of acts, I think that will go forward so much more. I mean, taking a very banal example, cigarette smoking, right? Considered absolutely normal, not a big deal, everybody did it, until it suddenly became, first off, everybody knew it wasn't healthy, that didn't do it, but when it started to really change was when public opinion turned against it, and that's when a lot of the legislation was passed, that was when a lot of the social activism came out against cigarettes and that sort of thing. And certainly sexual assault is a much more worthy platform to attend to, but once that has that sort of public outcry against that is when I think things will change. Not because we have changed as individuals, but because we have a better understanding of how to ensure the safety, of women and anyone. It could be men, could be anyone. People should not have their power taken away from them like that. So that's my stand on that. wanted to go ahead and take this opportunity to see what the authors on the panel are working on next, and also, Karen, what books you've recently read in particular that you found have had a real interesting thing to say about this topic or about history in general, just something that really has captured your interest. We'll go ahead and start with Sharon and see just what your new works are going to be about, and whether or not you have this sort of conflict in those books as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sorry about the dogs again. It's a bad day. I'm working on a story right now that's coming out through Viking in 2016, early winter, and it's more adventures on the high seas. Come here. And a traveling story. It's about a story of. I'm sorry, I'm going to hold my dog, and I think she'll shut up then. So yeah, there is. Like I said earlier, there's a question of the sexual violence between people on a ship, the two men on a ship. So that was really interesting to me of how that plays a part. So that's going to be included. So more, it's going to be a little bit edgier, I guess is the word, than Folly was. As far as any other sexual violence in there, what I'm actually trying to think about. I don't know if you guys saw that post by a blogger named Meg who blogs for Cuddle Buggery. Have you ever that one? It's really good. It's about I wrote it down, sex positive YA, and she's talking about how she was kind of slut shamed in school, and there weren't any books for women about, probably outside of Forever, where you could sort of be. The characters were in positive feelings about sex, and not just them either being raped or being abused or any of that, or just having that one special boyfriend, whatever. And she was really right. And in Folly too, I tried to keep Vicky's feelings towards Will, and even the nude model, the feelings that she had were true to her, and that's how she felt. And I want that to be that if you do have as a young woman, we all have, we still do, we all have feelings, and it just didn't start whenever. It didn't just start when women sort of, started burning their bras. They all knew about their bodies. They all, this was no mystery to them. And so I want to think about that in doing my next story, is that this girl's Victorian, yes, but she still has crushes on guys. She still has feelings for guys. She still, wonders how she fits in the world. So that's really important to me, to think about that and portray those feelings in a positive, safe, way. And I think that's kind of what I'm thinking about when I'm drafting this next story. And it's set in the mid-Victorian era, so it's a lot of really interesting time.
Great. Catherine?
I'm really looking forward to that book, Sharon. And I agree with Sharon that having more books and more stories out there about girls who do have not just romantic feelings, but also sexual feelings, sexual urges. They need to be out there, because of course we're all people, and we all have these feelings, and they shouldn't be repressed or thought unclean for whatever reason. I approached it a little bit in my book that came out in June called Brazen, and that's one of the reasons it's called Brazen, is because she feels this way. It's set in Henry's court, and this girl wants to explore all these feelings with her husband, but isn't allowed to because, again, sexual politics comes into play, and she's not allowed to consummate her marriage. But she finds that she wants to, and that makes her feel like there's something a bit wrong with her. But she still wants to be able to act on it. So like Sharon said, it's really important to have those positive feelings towards sex in YA novels too. And right now I'm working on a contemporary novel. It hasn't sold yet, but I'm loving working on this book. And even though rape is mentioned, and there are thoughts about it because of some of the things that occur within the novel, but as far as sexual politics goes, it more deals with how men and women look at each other and the ideas of objectification, and how, you know, people can look at women as just this series of parts rather than a person as a whole. And it's been very interesting to be able to explore that, and I've been exploring it from the boys' point of view, so it's a completely different take for me on being able to approach these kinds of subjects.
Outstanding. The newest book that I'm working on, Maid of Wonder, deals with a young woman who is gifted with the sight in Queen Elizabeth's court, and it was a strange time to have that kind of ability. They absolutely believed in the ability to talk to angels. It was a very coveted psychic gift. However, at the same time, you could only go so far with it before, you know, being burned by the church. So in my story, the persecution that Sophia faces is very much for being different, for being the outsider, for being somebody who does not fit into the mold, who's not following the proper protocols. And so while not sexual in nature, it is still very much the idea of not being able to claim your own power, because the society in which you're living is not ready for you to claim that power. We talked a little bit, Sharon mentioned a little bit about slut shaming as well, and that's certainly become a focal point for a lot of discussion with both historical and predominantly contemporary romance. I think that you will find, or young adult romance, I think that you'll find that it continues to be a key topic for discussion. And Karen, I actually was interested, do you find your readers discussing that issue, or books that they feel are slut-shamey, if you will, towards any characters? Is that something that comes up with your readers?
You know, I feel like there's a big recognition now of the concept of slut-shaming, and it's really interesting because occasionally, like the other day, a blogger had taken a picture of a scene from a book and sent it out. They're like, "This is slut-shaming and it's awful," and I thought, oh, well, that's interesting, because it's, you know, I mean, like, I didn't know how to judge it, because I'm like, I haven't read the whole book. I've read this passage, you know. In the upcoming A.S. King book called the Gloria O'Brien's History of the Future is really interesting, because this character is kind of about this character and her friendship with her best friend, and she is talking to her dad about her friend, and she calls her a slut. And I was like, well, this is really weird, because this is not what I expect from A.S. King. But then later in the book, you know, the character has this moment of reflection. She's like, I don't know why I keep calling her that. And that was, to me, like a reminder, like, you have to read the whole entire thing before you can, you know, judge a book. And the passage that the person had tweeted is from a book called Killer Instinct, and it's really interesting because I'm very ambivalent about this chapter, because or this passage, because the character is very much slut-shaming her sister, who's very sexually active, but her sister is also a psychopath, you know, bloody serial killer. So she's not really a reputable source or character witness.
Oops.
So, you know, I was like, well, it is slut-shaming, but it was, you know, like, I watched way too much Criminal Minds, and I'm like, you know, a lot of them would feel that, you know, that's part of their psychopathology. So I'm like, I don't know. I wanted to say, though, you guys were talking about that blogger who talked about sex-positive YA, and as part of that Sexual Violence in Young Adult Literature project, Krista, Carrie, and I all made lists, which you can find at the Hub, of sex-positive YA titles. And I know a lot of people are really uncomfortable with the idea of sex-positive YA, because, you know, people get really hung up about the idea of talking with teens about sex and that type of stuff, because, you know, nobody really wants teens to be having sex, because, you know, teen pregnancy, which, you know, and all those things. But the reason that sex-positive YA is important is because, you know, I mean, this is the time when you're really starting to think about it and ask those questions. and start to, you know, develop your ideas of what sex is and how those sexual exchanges can take place. And we need to see positive examples of that too, so that, you know, teens, and I mean, and reading is a safe environment to do that, you know, so that teens, when they get to a point where they're really thinking about it or find themselves in a situation, you know, they know how it could look like and how to have those conversations and what kinds of things that they can say and how to ask the right questions. So we do have a few lists on there of some sex positive way. And then I just recently read this book called This Side of Salvation by Jerry Smith, I think Reedy. And it was a really fascinating book. There's a lot of like religion and cult stuff happening in it. But in it, this boy who is a virgin and a very devout Christian, you know, starts dating a girl who's very sexually experienced, and she's very comfortable with her sexuality. And, you know, she doesn't pressure him. You know, they can have conversations about it. It's really fascinating because he even prays about whether or not he wants to have sex with her. And it was a great book in terms of, you know, showing how a girl can have, you know, be a sexual person and be okay with that and be comfortable with that, and how a guy cannot want to wait, and that's okay too. You know, it was like that role reversal thing, and it was really, you know, just an awesome book because of that.
That's great. Okay, we are at 1 o'clock. Karen, do we have any more time left, or should we wrap it up?
We can wrap it up. I always hate when they're over, though.
I know. Oh, let's talk about this.
Yeah. So much to say. I mean, there's really, yeah. I guess, but the last thing that I would just want to add is that I would hope that, and I know all of us are probably feeling the same way, that, you know, it's important for our readers to understand that we're here for them, and that, you know, we give them the voice and give them books that they can, like what Karen said it so perfectly, you can sort of take your feelings out on a spin and see how that's going to look when you read these books, and that, you know, we've been where you've been. We remember it well. It wasn't always fun to be a teen and to be a young adult, and we understand and 100% here for you. So, I'm sure everybody's feeling that same too when you write these books, and it's a privilege to be able to write books for young readers. I feel that way anyway.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Great. Thanks, Sharon.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about the beagle.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for coming, and I will post this and do a recap soon. So to everybody out there watching this and taking part and watching all of our conversations about sexual violence, thank you very much, and please help us continue the conversation.